Sheriff John Montgomery, Baxter County. Are you here? Coming forth. There you are. Welcome, Matthew. Do you have any comments? I'm moving right now.
Thank you, Senator Elliott, and my apologies. To see our highway department hard at work this morning in South Arkansas, so glad to be here. Sheriff, welcome to the task force, and you're free to make your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I also want to say thank you to the task force members, because having served on other task forces, in this case, it's a daunting task to try to come up with some recommendations and solutions to a problem that's been around for many, many years. A little bit about myself. Some of you know me. I know and call my friends, but I've been in law enforcement for more than 25 years. I am currently serving in my 11th year as sheriff in Baxter County. Baxter County, the Mountain Homes County seat. We're a Class 4 county. I would consider us a medium-sized county. We have a 100-bed facility. So we're about medium-sized as far as the state. This invitation was extended to me, and I'm going to say in part due to a newsletter that I put out a couple months ago. And there's a copy of that newsletter entitled Enough is Enough in front of you. I also want to point out that while I am the president of the Arkansas Sheriff's Association, some of the opinions that I'm going to express today are not necessarily the opinions of every sheriff across this state. If there's one message I could get across to you today, it's repeat offenders. We hear a lot about prison overcrowding, and that, of course, puts it back into our county jails. We're backed up, and all those numbers are somewhat down. At one point, I think they reached about 2,900 backed up in the county jails. But the repeat offenders, more than anything, in my opinion, is what is causing us the most heartache and the most havoc. And I'm going to give you just a couple of quick examples of what I'm talking about. Currently, and I say currently unless he's been transferred in the last day or two, there's an inmate sitting in Boone County, which is Harrison. That inmate is currently had his parole revoked, and he is due to go back to the Arkansas Department of Corrections. Baxter County has sent him to prison 5 times. Missouri has sent him to prison also. He's 48 years old, and he's been sentenced to 54 years in prison. He's currently sitting in Boone County Jail, ready to go back for the 7th time, and he is eligible to be paroled directly out of the Boone County Jail after 90 days. That repeat offender not only does not get it, he's not going to get it. And I had a small little wager with the Boone County Sheriff that in 30 days he would have already broken in. Once he gets out, he'll have broken into someone else's home or their vehicle or their building. And the problem when you have that is because although he is not, quote, a violent offender, when you break into someone's home, the potential for violence escalates drastically. He's a repeat offender and is not going to get it. The second example I want to give you is currently we have warrants, felony warrants, to arrest a couple that have broken into storage buildings. They've broken into more than 20 vehicles, and they have fled the area. We have warrants for their arrest. They've both been to prison. And I got a call from the prosecutor a couple of weeks ago, and he said one of the mothers just called me and said they know there's a good chance they may be going back to prison. But they're just going to lay low because they want to enjoy their summer. They know they won't spend more than 3 or 4 months in prison if they go back, and they'd rather spend their time in prison over the winter so they'd be out by spring to enjoy next year. Now what that tells me is that prison is no longer something that people are afraid of. There's something it doesn't bother them to go back. And that to me is a difference. 25 years ago, when I started my career in law enforcement, when you ran across someone that had been to prison before, they would tell you, I don't want to go back. Please do not make me go back. And that's no longer the norm anymore. If you could see the number of grievances I get from the inmates in my county jail begging me to get out of my jail so they can go to prison. Why would you want to get out of a local jail to go to prison? That's a problem. Second thing I want to bring up, and I don't have the numbers, and I would encourage you to get with the Department of Corrections, is the number of inmates that are revoked or sent to prison for 6 months or less. In my opinion, if this is their, let's say not their first time, sending them to prison for 6 months is a waste of taxpayers' money. It does no good. And so what we're doing when they get revoked, again, going back to the gentleman who's on his way for the 7th time, who's going to get paroled out of a county jail, sending them back for 4, 5, or 6 months, certainly is not getting the message across. And at the same time, it's, in my opinion, a waste of bed space and taxpayers' dollars. And I will tell you, the criminal know the system better than law enforcement, prosecutors. I see Mr. Cassidy here, and I would bet he would agree with this. They can tell you better than their own defense attorneys. They know when they set up and work out a plea bargain, they can tell you almost to the day when they're going to get out. They know better than anybody. And when they get picked up and revoked and sitting in the jail, they know how long they're going to sit there, they know when they're going to go, and they know when they're going to get paroled out. Another point I want to at least bring up, and I would like to see the statistics. I can only speak from my personal experience. But the older criminal, it appears to me the recidivism rate is much less. When they get up around 55 or so, 60, we rarely see them reoffend. Now, I don't know if that's, they get tired. I think they finally figure it out, maybe. I'm not sure. But I think when you look at, on the parole side, and some of the sentencing, we also need to kind of look at that. Because those are some areas that maybe we can take some different approaches to those older folks that are in the system that possibly could be let out. One other point I would like to make, and again, this is my opinion, but one of the things that we could do to help, and this is going to sound probably not norm coming from myself, I have been accused of being too tough of a sheriff, lock everybody up, and while probably 25 years ago that might have been the truth, I also realized we can't lock everybody up. But one of the things that I look at, when you look back 20, 25 years ago, and you look at the cocaine problem, that was the big hot topic, and the sentences that were being handed down for cocaine were extremely harsh and extremely long. Well, that's somewhat softened up, and now we're doing the same thing with methamphetamine. And while methamphetamine is a serious drug and it causes serious problems, I'm not sure we shouldn't look at that methamphetamine sentencing and make it more in line across the board with what cocaine is now. I've got 309 inmates is a kind of a glorified trustee that we've got from the Department of Corrections that we house. I can think of one gentleman that was sentenced to 30 years on methamphetamine. And he's, again, over 50. And I'll be honest with you, he's a great worker, he's got many skills, he doesn't need to be sitting in prison. And those are some things that we can look at to do. Another thing would like to point out, and this again is, I think, is a problem across the state. In Baxter County, we have a great faith-based system. We have, I believe it's 13 churches that participate in jail ministry. And they do a very good job. And they come in and administer the inmates. But where they have, in my opinion, do a bad job is once that inmate gets out of jail. And while I think the prison ministry is also very successful, I think that there's a whole lot more to be done, because when those inmates get out of prison, there's that support system falls off drastically. And I think that support system needs to be there even more so after they're out of prison than they are necessarily in. Another point I'd like to raise concerns the mentally ill. Just like all across the state, and I hear many of the other sheriffs that talk about the inmates that's in their jail because of mental illness. And to be honest with you, most of the time they shouldn't be there. They need to be in treatment center somewhere. But I want to give you just one quick example, and I'm going to have to throw a few dates in, so I hope you can follow. We had a gentleman who has a severe mental illness. He's been in our jail 10 times. And he was there up until Monday, 2 days ago. But what happened was he was picked up again for assaulting a family member, and it was due to his mental illness. And he was picked up on October 29th of last year, almost a year ago. After he was evaluated, it was determined that he needed treatment. We had to wait until February the 11th before a bed opened up for us to send him. So from October 29th till February 11th, he sat in our jail, not where he needed to be. But we have no place to go because there's no bed space. So we transport him on February the 11th. On February 21st, 10 days later, we get a call. He's cured. Probably not those exact words, but come get him. So when the deputies go to pick him up, the doctors wrote a note, may still be suicidal. Now that's funny in one sense, but it's sad in another one. In the process, he attacks the two deputies, actually having to have one of our deputies have to be treated. So what does he have? He has new charges. So he's ordered to be reevaluated. So we wait. The evaluation doesn't happen until April the 8th. But they put it off until June the 8th. So on June the 8th, he's evaluated and told that he will now go back to the middle. We transported him Monday, September 28th. Now you think about that. This is just one example of, I could tell you dozens more, and the sheriffs all across the state have that same problem. So when we talk about this committee, one thing I asked you to strongly look at, there is not enough mental illness beds, for lack of a better way of putting it, across this state. And I would almost guarantee that if you looked at the prison system, they've got the same issue there. There's people in the system that shouldn't be in the system. I know there's another committee that's talking about the mental illness issue. San Antonio has got a system in place that they now have crisis centers. And I think that's something that we need to look at strongly to do that. I'm going to say again, we need to spend a lot more time on repeat offenders. One thing that I would like to see, and I don't have the number, but I would almost guarantee the number will be extremely high. If you could look at either the people that's currently in prison or the current people that are currently waiting to go to prison that's been to prison 7, 8, or more times. What I get very frustrated is when I hear people talk about, even testimony, where they say, you know what, we don't need to be locking up the thieves, we need to be locking up the dangerous people. Well, if you lived in, I'm just going to say Little Rock, Pine Bluff, some of those places, you probably are worrying about the rape, robbery, murder. But that's a small segment of the state of Arkansas. And Baxter County is no different. We're not worried about rape, robbery, murder. What we are worried about is the gentleman who's broken in and been sent to prison 8 and 9 times for burglary and theft, who are wreaking havoc, who's stealing things from our homes. And the potential there, and I can tell you several instances where they've broken into homes thinking there was no one home, and fortunately, no serious injury occurred of it. Those are the people, to me, that we need to be concentrating our effort on. The newsletter that you have in front of you goes through several areas that I think, again, somewhat controversial. Some things that I think that should be looked at. But one of the things that I think we need to do, and again, this is my opinion, but one of the things I think we need to do is we need to concentrate heavier. And when I say the first time offenders, I'm not talking about the first time they get sent to prison. In our county, and I suspect this is true across the state, typically they're going to have to get their 5th or 6th conviction of a felony before they will ever go to prison. So what I really wished we could do somehow is to take those the first time they're convicted of felony, and let's get them into some sort of a, call it what you will, maybe it's not a prison, maybe it's another type of facility where they're evaluated. Let's see what the issue is. Is it job skills? Do they not have a driver's license? Do they not even know how to interview for a job? And let's concentrate on those first-time felony convictions, and let's help them. Let's figure out what we can do to help them succeed. And if they don't get it at that point, then the sentencing needs to be a little bit harsher. And by the third or fourth time, if they're still not getting it, they're hurting society, and we need to come down even stronger on them. Again, these are issues that y'all are facing, and you've been listening to this numerous times. One other thing I want to point out, this really doesn't, in a sense, have to do with the prison overcrowding, because actually it's probably going to be the reverse of that. Recently, the parole board, the Department of Corrections board passed an OVG, offender violator guide. And in that guide, and I actually had some input in that. But one of the things that was left out of that guide that I take personally, not necessarily offensively, but that one thing was left out is violating someone for not paying back restitution. And so you think about this, you've got a victim out there that had their home broken into, maybe they were assaulted, they've had hospital bills. So now they've been a victim once. So finally you get the offender caught, they go in front of the judge then turns around and sentences them and orders them to pay back restitution. And if they don't, the victim is getting victimized again because they're not even getting reimbursed for what they're out. And yet, we're not going to violate them just because they're not paying back restitution. We take that very aggressively in Baxter County, and I can just tell you that over the last 10 years, we've paid back more than $2 million in restitution. And some of these are widows and widowers who don't have much money. But when they get that check for $75 or $100, it means the world to them. And it just seems not right that we're not going to hold the people accountable that should be held accountable. So again, I appreciate the opportunity, and I would entertain any questions if I might.
Thank you, Sheriff. Any questions? I would ask one question, and it's something that I ask different people from time to time. If there was one thing you could change today, what would it be? I mean, what would be the top? What do you think should be the top priority as far as making a substantive change that would really make a difference?
I think the number one thing would be putting something in place that would take those repeat offenders and could actually lock them up for longer periods of time. I think we're doing a poor job there. Now, the problem with that is we're lacking prison bed space now. So this didn't really come up to play, but I can tell you, in my opinion, we're going to need another prison. I know that's not popular. I know nobody wants to talk about it. We don't want to talk about what it's going to cost. And with all due respect to the the Department of Corrections board that asked for the, whatever it was, $80 million maximum security, I think that 1,000 to 1,200 beds could be, and more of a minimum security could be built for a whole lot less. But I think we need that first in order to make room for those people who continually violate and repeat over and over and over. Those are the people that's hurting our society.
Senator Elliott, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sheriff Montgomery, I was just trying to think about the problems we face kind of overall as a state, and I can assure you in Little Rock and Pine Bluff, we think much further along than the rapes and the other things that you mentioned. We have the whole gamut, just because of population, even a lot of thieves, as you say. But still, we're struggling to find some way forward with that without continuing to fill the jails all the time. So I would just like for you to discuss with me kind of the path that you're talking about is one that we have followed to get to where we are. So if you would kind of help me think, I'm not judging, I'm just, because I've been trying to read enough is enough while you were talking as well. So it feels to me as if we've gotten to where we are because of much of your testimony. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about how that squares with the United States and Arkansas at this point just being totally out of sync with most of people with whom we compare ourselves when we look at our prison population. That there must be something else going on. So kind of why should we go back down this same road? Or not all of it is, because I like what you said about the mental health, but just kind of talk me through that.
Well, and I think maybe this would be an easy way, Senator Elliott, to, and again, I want to repeat, I'm giving you an opinion.
Yeah,
I'm certainly not an expert,
Sure.
But one of the things that happen, a lot of times, inmates, whether they're in my jail or they're in prison, they're like children. I mean, when you think about it, if they're not in my jail, you've got children in school or wherever that if they're not being watched, they misbehave. But as long as they're being watched, they are. So I'm going to go back to Act 570, which was passed in 2011, I believe.
Yes.
And I certainly was down here at the Capitol screaming and hollering that I thought it was a bad plan. And I'll tell you first why. Act 570, in a sense, was brought about because of the prison overcrowding. And so what happened is we said, okay, we're going to reduce the penalty for theft. We're going to reduce the penalties for drugs. We're going to reduce those charges and the amount of time spent. We're also going to put all these other things in place to put people on probation rather than send them to prison. And we're going to make it easier to be paroled out of prison. And it worked. We actually did reduce the prison population. We went from, I think, 1,500 to 200. But here was, in my opinion, the flaw. In order for that to have worked, and even though I personally don't think that was the answer, the only way, in my opinion, that would have worked had they hired a substantial more probation officers. And here's why. Right now, we've got probation parole officers that's got clients 130 to 150 apiece. You couldn't possibly do a good job handling that caseload. If they had put more probation parole officers on to watch them, there's going to be a substantial number that, just like children, if you are watching them fairly closely, absolutely. And at the same time, that parole or probation officer can look at you and say, you know what, we need to help you because you don't have a driver's license, as an example. We need to help you figure it out. They can spend that one-on-one time with him. So, in my opinion, 570, while I may not have agreed with the overall concept, I think didn't have a chance to succeed because we didn't take that next step and spend the money to put those people in place, probation parole officers, to watch them. So, in answer to you, one of the things I suggested in there, which sounds extremely drastic, I think we need to do away with parole. Now, if I say that, you're going to have to revamp the system because you can't sentence somebody to 25 years and say you're going to do 25 years. When realistically, even under the federal system, maybe that should be 5 or 6 years on that serious of a charge. But you're going to do it all. But at the same time, those parole officers are now going to be working with those probationers to help them not go to prison in the first place. That's where I think that we can take what I'm talking about, those first timers. We need to help them. We need to spend the money and time and resources in rehabilitation, reentry, all of those things, helping them with job skills, teaching them a trade, to hopefully help them succeed. For those that don't get it, we need to stop wasting our time and resources on those.
Okay, thank you. And so if we know what we were doing, let's say prior to Act 570 was not working, and I totally agree that it was not funded, there's fewer things worse than having something that is evidence-based and you put it in place, and the parole officers were absolutely key to it being successful, along with some other things. What I'm wondering is, why wouldn't we take the position, if we know what works, why don't we fund that as opposed to almost retreating to where we were? And if we hire the parole officers, it seems to make sense to me to have a good segue. This is about not having parole at all. A good segue that's accompanied with enough parole officers so that we are not constantly stacking up the jails with people. And then I get back to the other industrialized countries and some other states to whom we compare ourselves, and we are doing worse than almost everybody as a country, and we are as a state. So going back to that seems odd to me. So I'm wondering what evidence there is, and I haven't seen it, that locking people up longer is going to produce a better person at the end of a longer sentence. Because nobody else does just longer sentences as a way of rehabilitating people by just making the sentence longer. We tend to have longer sentences than any other countries who do better at this than we do, and we get worse outcomes.
Well, and I do agree with you, and I certainly don't want to take our country and go to some of the, what I would call uncivilized methods. But prisons in other countries are much more harsh than ours. And again, I think you could look at
some of them, the ones that I'm talking about, are absolutely not more harsh than ours, and they get better outcomes.
Okay, and so again, where I'm saying is, what I think we did not correctly before 570. Okay, is I think we spent, what we were really doing was locking them up, letting them out. They reoffend, lock them up. So we were missing, and again, there's been things put in place for re-entry beds where we can teach them job skills. I think that's a step in the right direction. But at the same time, where you're going to take a parole and probation officer, they're going to be watching them, and again, their clientele is hopefully much smaller, where they can do a better job. For those folks that just don't get it, we're wasting the parole and probation officer's times. We are wasting tax dollars for them out of the system. But at the same time, it goes one step further. And I realize I'm a sheriff, but I'm tasked in keeping my community safe. And so for those folks that continue to reoffend and reoffend and reoffend, they're not getting it. And so you're right. I think some of the sentences in the beginning are way too long. I certainly think that's correct. I also think at the same time, some of these folks, by the time they finally get sent to prison, they're so deep, they've committed so many felonies, there's almost no way out. And that's where I'm talking about helping them more on the front end. So to me, my approach is two-phase. We need to help those folks on the front end early on to help them get and succeed. But at the same time, we also need to come down more harsh on those folks. And I'm not talking the second time they go down. I'm talking about the multiple repeat offenders. They need to be locked up to protect society.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cassidy, you're recognized for a question.
Sheriff, when you're talking about 570 down here on page 2 of your note, you say it seems like that some of our politicians and policymakers think the answer is to minimize or decriminalize thefts and property crimes. In fact, that's a lot of what 570 did, don't you think?
That's correct. It basically, in an overall nutshell, it reduced the penalty for virtually all the drug crimes and most of the theft crimes.
Okay. And all these folks that are getting revoked on parole, and you're talking about the repeat offenders, that's the people that, I tend to agree with that. We have a repeat offender problem. Do you think that's those 570 crimes that were reduced? Do you think that isn't that a lot of what we're dealing with? Isn't that a lot of what the repeat offenders are doing?
I think it's again, in my opinion, I think that's part of the problem. Certainly because we've reduced those penalties. And so now, therefore, they've committed their third, their fourth, or fifth theft. I think...
not only have we reduced the penalties, we've got them out we've taken extra efforts to get them out of prison more quickly, which puts them back on the street before they're ready to go. I get an email every time one of Baxter County residents gets parole from prison. Now, to be honest with you, about half of those emails that I get, I go,
Okay, not a problem. But the other half, I sit there and shake my head, usually early in the morning while I'm drinking my coffee, going, you've got to be kidding me. And that's the problem. We're letting those folks out too early that it shouldn't be.
And when you talk about the repeat offenders, you talk about even the fourth time offenders where you want to upgrade what they can be sentenced to. When somebody goes in and they have committed a new crime while on parole, and you talked about sending them back for 6 months is not doing any good. That 6 months for the rest of the folks in the room, that 6 months is parole policy, correct?
I can't answer that, I'm not sure, so.
Okay, well, you know the process. They come in, they have a parole revocation hearing. They could be subject to the balance of the time that is left on their sentence, their original sentence.
That's correct.
Correct? But they have an opportunity to say, well, I don't want my hearing. I want to waive my hearing, and I want to go down to prison for 6 months. That's a policy, right?
I think that's correct.
Parole policy. They could be subject to the whole sentence. They could be sent down for the rest of that whole sentence, correct?
Correct.
Would you be in favor of a law that said they go, for certain crimes, particularly maybe violent crimes, particularly for burglaries, breaking and enterings, that the people will go down for the balance of their sentence if they're revoked for that new crime?
I certainly would be in favor of looking at something that was, let's just say, much longer than 6 months. Now, whether that was the full balance or not, I'm not sure. It would depend on the crime. Small, I'd say petty theft, no. But for something that's serious and violent, absolutely.
Burglary, breaking and entering?
One of the things this last legislative session, and I pushed very hard for, and Governor Hutchinson and I spoke about at length, and burglary is now considered a personal crime. And I felt like it should be all along. Interestingly enough, no one, and we shouldn't say no one, but those that were running for office didn't even know it wasn't a personal crime. When you look at people breaking into your home, now I'm not talking about a business. To me, a business is somewhat different. If you break into a business, that's a commercial building. Although that's wrong, it's much different than breaking into someone's home. And so to me, it is now a personal crime. It should have been all
along. Another thing, and it might, I know you don't speak for the association necessarily while you're up here, but there have been a number floated around by the Sheriff's Association that an acceptable backup and manageable backup for the state's jails and detention facilities, county detention facilities, would be 1,600. Is that still a number that y'all believe is manageable?
That's still a number that the association is touting. Now, I want to just quickly step back. Prior to 570, and I'll go back a few years, 1,000 was considered a crisis, which is why prior to 570, when we got up to about 1,400, everybody was up in arms. That's kind of what propelled 570, that study to come through to try to figure out how to reduce. Well, we went from 1,300 to 2,800. And again, in my opinion, a lot, certainly probably can't say all, but a lot of it had to do with 570 because I kept saying, down there when I testified several times, I said, the problem is you're going to fix the problem today, but you're going to make the problem worse. And again, even though I don't think it had a chance of succeeding, in my opinion, the fact that there was not an substantial additional probation officers put in place, it was doomed for failure.
I think most folks will point to some folks will point to the parole reforms that came through as part of why you have a significant jail backup or have had significant jail backup. Would you agree with those?
Yes.
And the backup today is around 1,900.
I think that's somewhere in that range, yes, sir. If I can make one more comment. One of the things, though, that's interesting, and this is, I won't say it's a misconception, but it certainly is with some of the folks up in our area. They think when a person's revoked that they just got brought in and they're revoked. In virtually every case of the person that's sitting in my jail on a revocation, it's new charges. It's not that they just just got revoked, they have actually been arrested and charged with new charges.
Sure.
Now, I'm going to also say, and I'm going to sort of, if you will, kind of go after the prosecutors across the state. At the same time, what happens is when that parolee says, okay, I'll go back to prison. I'll take my 6 months and I'll go. Many times those charges are dropped. Now, I first want to tell you why. Now, I'm not a prosecutor, but I want to tell you.
I've heard people say that. I don't necessarily agree that
Well,
that's happening. But
it is happening in our area. Okay, so, but I want to tell you why. Because here's the problem. The problem that you have is if, let's just say, little Johnny over here goes and breaks into someone's home and he's been to prison 2 or 3 times, so he gets revoked. So he sits in our jail for a substantial period of time, and finally he says, okay, I'll take my 6 months or whatever the case may be, and I'll waive that. Well, the prosecutor will contact us, and we're as guilty as anybody, I'll be the first to tell you. Because here's what happens if they don't drop the charges. What happens is little Johnny goes to prison. And now in about 3 months, we get a phone call saying we need to go down to prison and pick up little Johnny and bring him back in front of the judge. So we drive, in our case, we're in northern Arkansas, you drive clear across the state, you pick up little Johnny, bring him back in front of the judge. Judge says, okay, you have a lawyer? Yeah, okay, let's take him back. Now you take him back to prison. In about another 30 days, we get an order saying go pick him back up again. And we bring him back up. It's usually the 3rd or 4th time we bring him back before he is convicted of that burglary. So from a simple cost standpoint, it becomes not feasible, if you will. That's why, in my opinion, a lot of times those charges are dropped. I would also like to see, since you brought that up.
But if the person's getting revoked and they are susceptible to being revoked because of their new crimes, I guess, what's the loss there? Isn't that how the system is supposed to function?
Well, they're going to go down, they're going to spend 5 or 6 months, the charges are dropped. If those charges stay in place by the time they're convicted, there's a chance they'll end up doing 3 or 4 years more time. Absolutely. And they're off the street and we're protecting the citizens. I also wish we would take technology, because it's out there. And instead of us having to run the inmate back and forth all the time, why we could spend a little money on the technology we could be doing a lot of this conferencing, teleconference, instead of having to go back and forth. So again, that wasn't part of my presentation, but I wish this committee would look at possibly funding some technology so that there wouldn't be the.
And then one other thing I wanted to ask you about that you brought up, you're not, when you talk about treating meth cases possibly the same or treating other cases, are you talking about lowering the threshold for sentences on meth manufacturing?
Case by case basis, yes, I am.
Mr. Magnus, you're recognized for a question.
Sheriff, we do a lot of debating on the criminal justice system, don't we? And but you know and I know that if sometimes if we was to be harder on repeat offenders and jail them more, it's not necessarily, it could be more time on the front end, more bed space on the front end, but sometimes we're holding these people anyway. It's just on installment plan. If a guy comes back 8 times, if we could have cut it down in 4 times, it might save bed space. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree.
But even at that, if parole is harder or harder on parole, will we agree or disagree whether it needs to be a minimum security or a maximum security bed? We need more beds in the system. Would you agree?
I don't see how we can continue to protect the citizens of this state of Arkansas unless we have more beds. I just don't see how, because right now that number's gone from 2,800 to whatever it is, 19 or 2,000. But there's folks that's being let out early that should not be let out, and they will be picked back up again.
Do you think the backup into county jails and the pressure that keeps on us, or the system, I shouldn't say us, that allows some of that?
Well, there's no question, and here's the downside, and I know Senator Elliott's left, but we're going back to the restitution issue. There's a lot of warrants that these sheriffs and police chiefs can't serve because there's no place to put them. So we've got people that's not being held accountable for their crimes because there's no place to put them. And yes, certainly, I can tell you, stacking on the floor is not where I want to put them for a number of reasons, okay? But myself and all the sheriffs across the state, when you're full and you've filled every bed, we're putting them on the floor. And so as a result, we're screaming at you and Ms. Kelly, I mean, saying, hey, Director Kelly, we've got to have room, we've got to have space, because they're sitting on the floor. Well, as a result, when you get phone calls, people screaming, y'all are doing everything you can to try to help us. But I think you're doing it, again, you pay me now or pay me later. You pay me now by letting them out and taking the inmate out of my bed. The problem is you're letting folks go that shouldn't be let go, and so we're all going to pay later.
Would you say that we all know that the parole officers out there in the field, that they need to be helping a lot of these offenders get jobs, help them try to succeed. But having enough adequate space, whether it be in your facility or our facilities, no matter what, that can only help parole being effective, because if there's not a place to put someone, parole becomes ineffective. Would you agree?
Well, there's no question. It's no different. I go back to my analogy of children. If you have a child that's misbehaving and you tell that child, if you don't behave, this is what's going to happen, and if they continue to misbehave and you up the punishment or the sanction, if you will, if you have no place to put them and don't think they don't know it. Early in my presentation, I talked about how they know the system. And a quick analogy, at one point a couple of years ago, we actually had to remove some beds from our facility and shut down and have a maximum. It was a joke. They could tell us, oh, you don't need to worry about it, they've got a place to put you. And we heard that over and over and over. So if we don't have a place, and I go back to having more bed space, we need more prison bed space, because you've got to at least be able to hold some sort of a hammer over them that if they misbehave, there is going to be a sanction, and they've got to know that you're going to follow through with that sanction.
One of the things that you said a while ago, I guess maybe we have debated, I don't remember what we have, but it's somewhat apparent to me, and I know which 309 inmate you're talking about. This 50% rule on first offense meth, I'm not here to say that it ought to be 50% on the second charge or 50% on the third. I always, me both agree on repeat offenders, something more needs to be done. But level that playing field, meth versus cocaine versus, we can't include them on 1 year early outs or many other programs because of that 50%. First time meth offenders that come to prison, I understand sometimes it might not be the first time, but first time they come to prison, that 50% rule, do you believe that ought to be removed?
I certainly think it needs to be, and going back to Mr. Castleman, I said a case-by-case basis on that, because I go back to the particular, and he's not the only one. We've had others that's been through our system that, again, and I will say they're older age, but the problem is this particular guy, it was his first time. He got a ridiculous number of years. So if you're asking me, would I be in favor of that particular case? Yes. Now, you talk about a guy that's been picked up 3 or 4 times? Absolutely not.
We don't pass legislation on this.
No, and I understand that, Mr. Cass. I certainly do. And that's where the toughness comes, because again, I'm tough on crime, but at the same time, I also have to use a little bit of logic here. And I go back to, because I mean, Mr. Magnus and I both know who we're speaking of in my facility. He shouldn't be locked up. He's done, I don't know how many years, but he's certainly done an adequate time. Do I think he's going to fail again? No, I don't. Is there a guarantee? Absolutely not. But to me, if he was out and re-offended, then we need to come down even harsher on him.
Have you all signed on to his clemency petition to the governor?
I don't know that this particular one has. I don't know. I can't.
That's the solution for people on the case.
Thank you, Sheriff, thank you for traveling down today, and we appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
You recognize for a question.
Thank you. I'm sitting from the Mental Health Center, and I certainly have great appreciation for what you said about the mentally ill do not belong in jail. I want you to know there's a lot of people in the room here that have gone to San Antonio, that have seen the program down there. It's very impressive. Another group of a dozen of us went the last 2 days to Tulsa to look at the crisis unit there. And we were very, very impressed. And just so you know, we're working on some type of funding deal that will help us set up perhaps 3 crisis units in Arkansas to help keep the mentally ill out, to divert from jails and eventually from prisons. So hopefully that's going to happen. But you said that this case that you mentioned was in jail from October to February, a person that had mental illness. I'm just curious, you said it took that long to get bed. Was that in the state hospital in Little Rock, or are you talking about an adult psych unit somewhere in a hospital in Arkansas?
The first time he was sent to an adult psych unit, St. Vincent. That's where we picked him up and he attacked. This last time that he left on Monday was through the state hospital.
Right. Well, there certainly are occasions when there's 90 beds in Arkansas. It doesn't happen that often, but it does occasionally. And it's very difficult to get anybody in Ash, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. 80 beds and they stay full all the time.
And Mr. Newsom, I just want to say, again, I'm not the enemy. I mean, we're all like to together, but at the same time, let me just tell you, in northern Arkansas, to find a bed, this is not, it's norm for them to sit there 30 plus days.
Well, I think the majority of the inpatient psych beds are in Central Arkansas. We have one in our area in Buster, but the majority of them are there in Hot Springs. That's part of the problem. You mentioned that Baxter County residents are most concerned about repeat offenders who burglarize, and they do this numerous times. Do you think that most of the time that's associated with trying to get money to pay for drugs?
Absolutely.
Having substance abuse in
High percentage, absolutely. And that's where, going back in the newsletter, I talk about, and again, I'm certainly no expert, you would be, but what I see, and I've got a particular case in mind where they were sent off and was back in 28 days. And they're currently sitting in jail again because they tried to kill someone, all right? So, to me, the drug courts, which I think have been overall very successful, but when I look at our local area, what's failed in the drug courts, to me, they didn't really have a chance. Again, in my unprofessional opinion, if we could send them for a period of time, a lengthy period of time, where they're dried out, I mean, for lack of a better way, and then brought them back to drug court, to me, the success rate would be much higher. I'm just asking, do you think that's it?
I think very much so. And there's several specialty courts that I'm sure you're aware of that are part of criminal justice reform. The group that's meeting this afternoon, I think, is going to be looking at substance abuse. Casey Bright's going to be at Wapak, and Diane Skaggs from the Mental Health Council. But I agree with that. All of those specialty courts are very effective. What we saw in Tulsa was a tie-in between that 32-bed crisis unit and the drug courts. They do have, you mentioned technology. They have technology there with telepsych, and they're able to communicate with all the jails, jail administrators, and courts. They don't have to take those persons in. They have crisis beds for 23 hours or less, and some persons stay up to a week, and they're able to divert all our folks from jail and communicate without transporting back and forth.
And I think that's, again, technology, when you think about it, there's an initial cost, but when you look at the savings overall and the safety, it's by far better. And so, communicate. I know back a couple years ago, we were working with UNS to try to work something out, and although that didn't succeed, their facility basically had a room that the doctor would go in and could have that one-on-one. I can see that as a huge success for even those folks that I'm talking about that are waiting 30 days for a bed. They've been evaluated and they're just going to sit there in a room. Many times they're either being assaulted or they're assaulting other folks while we're waiting to get them. Even if it was through telemedicine, or that psychiatrist could have those communications on a daily or regular basis, I think would be extremely helpful. Now, in our case, do they want to travel down to our jail? Is it easy for us to take them up there and get appointments, and they don't want you typically in the waiting room? Those are the things where I think technology, an initial investment on the front end, would have a huge impact in the long term.
I've heard heard from the Sheriff's Association that there's a commitment to try to seek funding to do that in all county jails. I know they're doing a pilot in Jefferson County now. Mental Health Center is doing Oversight with them. Been doing that a little over a year. I think it's been quite successful.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Thank you.
Moving down the agenda, the next item